So I have completely gone down the rabbit hole, and I don't think I want to come back out again. The deeper and the further I go studying all the characters in the book, The Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, the more I realize Savannah sounds like paradise to me. Now again, the book, The Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, came out in 1994. I was 11 years old at that time. So of course, in 1994, I did not read the book. I would not have understood it in 1994, so I did read the book much later. However, it has been a while since I read the book. The movie The Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil came out in 1997, and I think most people will agree that the book is almost always going to be better than the movie adaptation. Now, I will say that the actors in The Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil did an incredible job. I mean, Kevin Spacey looks so much like Jim Williams looked. And I will remind you once again, and we talked about this in part 1 of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, which I will link below for you if this is your first time coming to my channel. But the story in the Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil is based on a true story about a murder, a true crime story in which Jim Williams was arrested for murdering a young man named Danny Hansford. Again, you can go back down and rewatch my first video if you want to hear more about that. However, I do say that what really caught people with this book wasn't necessarily the murder story. It was that all these people that lived in Savannah that this writer got to know had their own eccentric and exaggerated characters. I did say in part 1 that that is very common in the South, and these personality types are what make me proud of my Southern heritage. But before we go any further, please remember to hit that subscribe button and give us a like. Welcome to Esoteric Atlanta. My name is Bryce, and today we're going to be talking about the Hamilton Turner Inn. Now, the Hamilton Turner Inn obviously wasn't always an inn. It was first and foremost a house. Now, this house had 2 nicknames. The first nickname is just simply the mansion. The other nickname is the Grand Victorian Lady. Now, this house was originally built for a Samuel Hamilton, hence why it's the Hamilton Turner Inn. And this house was completed in 1873. Now, Samuel Hamilton was a very wealthy man. He was a jeweler. In fact, he owned a watch shop in Savannah, and he also made a lot of money during the Civil War. I'm not going to pretend to understand what he did in the Civil War to make this money. If you would like to research that, it's pretty much on every single website that talk about him. But as I said in previous videos, I freaking love history, but when it comes to understanding battles and different jobs and different military setups, my mind goes blank. So all I can tell you is that he did make a lot more money during the war. Now, his house, this mansion, was built on Lafayette Square, which is another square in Savannah, Georgia. And in fact, Samuel Hamilton had a nickname. He was called the Lord of Lafayette Square. Samuel Hamilton also ended up becoming the mayor of Savannah, Georgia. And since we are an esoteric channel, we're going to get a little bit back to our roots and what our original purpose was. He was the Grand Master of the Knights Templar here in Savannah. Now, Samuel's personal life is a little bit like a train wreck soap opera. And I just could not stop reading about what happened to him. He married his first wife in Charleston, South Carolina. Her name was Emma Spriggs, and they had 2 kids together. She died in 1862. He then went on to marry a woman named Sarah, whom they called Sally, in 1866. Now, the thing about Sally is that Sally was previously married to his brother, William, and William died of typhoid fever in 1862 as well. Now, Sally and William had children too. So then Samuel married his late brother's widow, so his sister-in-law, after his wife had passed away as well. So Samuel's coming into his new marriage with children, as well as Sally coming into this new marriage with her kids, who are also Samuel's nieces and nephews, and Samuel's kids were also her nieces and nephews because she was married to his brother. So they were cousins. So now these cousins are now step siblings. So Uncle Sam is now Papa Sam, and Aunt Sally is now Mama, and then they proceeded to have kids together. So their kids are also siblings and cousins to the other children in the house. Holy crap, what a tangled web we weave. This is seriously craziness. It does sound a little bit like the Old Testament too in the Bible, even though this was in the 1800s. But anyway, the Hamiltons, they were again quite a wealthy family, and Mr. Hamilton, Sam Hamilton, had this hobby of collecting artwork. He sounds a bit like Jim Williams, although Jim Williams was not straight and didn't have kids, and Sam Hamilton had a crap ton of kids. But I digress. He would collect all this famous art, and so he hired a guard to stand on the top of the house every night with a gun to protect his property. In an age before alarm systems, I can definitely see why Sam Hamilton would want to hire this guard. Well, one morning when they woke up, the guard never came downstairs, and so Sam went up to check on the guard, and it appeared that somebody had shot the guard in the back of the head in the middle of the night, and he was just laying on the roof in a puddle of his own blood. Now, this guard is supposedly one of the ghosts that haunt this house to this day, and people will say that at night you'll see cigar smoke coming from the top of the roof of the house, like the guard's up there just smoking a cigar. Now, the interesting thing is Sam Hamilton ended up taking over the position after his guard died. He would go on his roof and just guard his property himself, and he too died on the roof in 1899. Is this a coincidence, or is this just one of these Savannah curses? I don't know. But let's back up again. In 1883, Sam Hamilton's house became the first house in Savannah to get electricity. And in 1883, just one of the rooms got the power. And it kind of reminds me, when I was reading the stories of this, of when I was a little kid, during the holiday season, we would load up in the car and drive around and look at Christmas lights. I don't know if people still do that today, but we did that in the 80s and the 90s. Well, with Sam Hamilton's house, it appears that the locals were so intrigued by this electricity in this one room that they would come and stand outside while the sun was going down just to watch the Hamiltons turn the lights on in their house. And then in 1886, 3 years later, they got the electricity throughout the whole house. I am sure that this was quite a spectacular sight, seeing that before then, we didn't have electricity. And then again, after Sam Hamilton's death in 1899, the house stayed in the Hamilton family until 1915. Lord have mercy. All those kids, I'm sure they had no idea if they were cousins or siblings or what the hell was going on. I'm sure they were probably glad to get rid of the house in 1950. And it was bought by a Dr. Turner. So the Hamilton Turner house, or the Hamilton Turner Inn. Now, Dr. Turner, what's really fascinating about this house is, yes, this house, as I said, was the first house in Savannah to have electricity. And Dr. Turner was the first resident of Savannah to have an electric car. So this is like land of the future, modern times for Savannah. Now, Dr. Turner, he, like Sorrell's son at the Sorrell house we spoke about earlier, he practiced, he had his office in the basement of the house. Now, again, I'm going to remind people, this is not some creepy, morbid, macabre thing that people did back in this time. This was very, very normal. So nothing weird, that's just how it was. Now, they do say part of what Dr. Turner did for himself was also autopsies. So a lot of dead bodies came through the basement for him to look and see the cause of their death. Now, the Turner family first lived in the house from 1915 to 1926, and they moved out in 1926 and held the house as a boarding house. Again, we talked about that with Miss Peggy. This was common to have boarding houses. We said back in the 20th century, early 20th century, it was not appropriate for women or single people to have an apartment. You typically would rent a room out of a boarding house. It was kind of like a sorority that wasn't, or fraternity that wasn't necessarily associated with the university. It was just like renting a room. So even though the Turners were not living in the house, they still owned it and were collecting rent off of it. But the boarding house only lasted for 2 years. And then in 1928, he rented the house out to the Marine Hospital for their nurses to live in. You know, I don't know if military hospitals have places for their employees, like nurses, to live nowadays. I'm not 100% sure about that, but I kind of guess that it's kind of along the same lines of like a boarding house, that if you have all these young nurses, which at that day, in that time period, were typically women. I know that's changed now, but in the 1920s, it was typically young women who were nurses. And so I can understand if he's renting it out to the Marine Hospital, he's basically renting it to a hospital for these young single women to live at the house so they don't have to go and be scandalous and rent their own apartment or whatever. And then in 1940, the Turners decided to move back into the house. So they brought their family right back in, and Dr. Turner resumed his work in the basement of the Turner house as a physician. Now, one theme along all of these owners of the Turner house that we'll see as we move even further into our story is that they all love to party. The Hamiltons love to throw lavish parties. The Turners love to throw lavish parties. They got wild. They were just the Southern elite having Southern elite fun. And with the Turners, what they would do is when they would have these grand old parties, they would send their children upstairs. Now, upstairs, they had some billiard rooms where they would play pool, but the kids typically were kept away from the adult entertainment. When my parents threw parties when I was a kid, I mean, same for us. We were like banned from coming down where the adults were. We would have to sit in the back of the house or whatever and watch TV or something. So some things don't ever change in the South. But these kids would sometimes want to peep and see what the adults were doing. And so what they would do, this sounds like a big thing a kid would do, is they would take one of the billiard balls and they would throw the ball down the stairs like it accidentally had fallen down the stairs. And then they would run and collect the ball and peep and see what their parents were doing before going back upstairs again. It gave them an excuse to come down. Well, one night, one of the little girls, one of the Turner girls, threw a billiard ball down the stairs and then accidentally fell herself and died. So nowadays, people say that she still haunts the house, and a lot of times you can hear the sound of a billiard ball bouncing down the stairs over and over and over again. And then in 1965, the Turner family sold the house, and they sold the house to the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. Now, this church, they wanted to tear the house down and turn it into a parking lot, a freaking parking lot. But alas, the Savannah Historical Foundation stepped in and said, sorry, church, this property is not going to be a parking lot. It's got too much history and too much value to our city to ever be disrespected like that. I mean, I don't even think Jesus would want to tear down this house. Besides, if you tear it down, where the hell are all the ghosts gonna live? So in the 1970s, thanks to the Savannah Historical Foundation, this house was turned into an apartment complex. Now, again, in the beginning, I told you that this house, a nickname for this house is the Mansion. If you're in Savannah and they refer to the Mansion, this is the house that they're talking about. That's because this house was so big that it hosted about 17 bedrooms. So when I say that it was an apartment complex, it was big enough to legitimately become an apartment complex. However, though, as I told you in part 1 of our story, around this time, Savannah had turned into a dump. There was a lot of crime. It just was not a very great place to live. And Jim Williams from the Mercer house in part 1 was part of the reason why Savannah is what Savannah is now. He moved in Savannah, he bought up a bunch of houses, and he remodeled them. So this is right before we have the murder of Danny Hansford in 1981, that this was not really the nicest of houses. It had kind of lost its charm, and some of the articles I read about what it looked like was it turned into one of these rundown kind of party apartments. I mean, it was run down, but I think that whole house, that whole property has been a property of scandalous parties since the very beginning. Now, one of the residents of the mansion, of this house, and subsequently also the manager of this apartment complex / house, was a man named Joe Oden. Now, Joe Oden is a character in Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Joe Oden also owned a bar with a woman named Nancy Hillis. Now, Nancy Hillis, again, she is also a character in Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Now, when John Berendt was writing the book, Nancy told him that she didn't want her real name used. So in the book, as well as the movie, her name is Mandy. Now in the movie, Mandy was played by Allison Eastwood, I believe Clint Eastwood's daughter. And Joe Oden was played by a man named Paul Hipp. Now, I'm going to refer back to the movie because I just recently watched the movie to do this series, and it's been a really long time since I've read the book. If you can remember from the movie, when John Cusack, who is playing John Berendt's character, gets to Savannah, there is a scene where he goes to bed and he plays a cassette player of all the traffic of New York to help him sleep. And then soon after, while he's sleeping, a woman, Mandy, comes to knock on his door. She takes him to another house where there's a guy playing the piano and there's a wild party going on. The guy playing the piano is Joe Oden, and the wild party is the wild party that is happening at the Hampton Turner house, which was an apartment complex at that point. Joe Oden was a wildcat. He was very scandalous. His parties were described as Gatsby-esque. Now in the book, as well as in the movie, it is implied that Mandy and Joe Oden had, or Nancy Hillis in real life, and Joe Oden had this love affair. That's not true. That's not true because Joe Oden was gay. And in fact, Joe Oden died the same year as Jim Williams, but he died of AIDS. Now, the bar that Nancy and Joe owned together, where they played and she sang and performed and he did his musician stuff, was called the Sweet Georgia Browns, and it was a jazz club. Nowadays, you can still go to the Sweet Georgia Browns, but it is not called that anymore. It is now called Bar Bar. So if you're in Savannah and you go to Bar Bar, that is the location where Nancy, or in the movie she's called Mandy, and Joe would perform. Now, Joe originally was a tax attorney, but he didn't do that well with being a tax attorney, and so that's when he turned his life over to music and started partnering up with Nancy, aka Mandy. Now, there is a scene that you see in the movie Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil where, again, John Cusack, playing John Barrett's character, goes to their bar and you see Nancy, aka Mandy, played by Allison Eastwood, singing in the microphone while Joe is playing the piano in the back. That's legit. That's what they did together. Now, as I was reading about the real life Mandy, or as her real name, Nancy, I realized that, in my opinion, even though Allison Eastwood is beautiful and played the character well for the story, she wasn't as eccentric as the real Nancy seemed to be. She seemed to be a bit of a personality type. Now, they call her the Vamp of Savannah. And Nancy Hillis, her whole life was a beauty queen. And she actually, in 1986, she won Big Beautiful Woman of Las Vegas. She was quite the hoot. Now, as I said earlier, Joe Oden passed away of AIDS in 1991, and he passed away in the Hamilton Turner house. Part of the haunting, so we have the haunting of the guard up on the roof where people see cigar smoke. We also have the haunting of the Turner daughter that throws the ball down the stairs. And with Joe Oden, many people claim to wake up in the middle of the night and hear lavish parties and piano music playing. Is that Joe Oden? Maybe. Now, after Joe Oden passed away in 1991, Nancy Hillis took ownership of this house. She lived in this house until 1997 when she sold it. Even though she sold the house to the Strickland couple, she ended up living in the basement. And then over the years, the house changed ownership with many couples. In 2003, it was bought by Rob and Jane Sells, and they actually started to restore the house. So I told you that when Joe Oden lived in the house, it was an apartment complex. He managed it, and it was gross. It was not kept up with. It was just a bunch of wild kids, young people partying every night, having these Gatsby-style parties. And I'm assuming from what I read that even when Nancy sold the house to the first couple, it kind of remained the same. Even though she lived in the basement of the house, it still didn't quite live up to its original glory of being the mansion. But then in 2003, that's when, again, it was sold to another couple, and that's when it looks like they started to work on the restoration of the house. They started to really clean it up and bring it back to its glory. And then after that, it was bought by Gay and Jen Dunlop, and they actually worked with the Historic Savannah Foundation. So that's where the house really was brought back to life. Now, Nancy Hillis, aka Mandy, aka Allison Eastwood, ended up passing away in 2016. She had ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, sadly. She died around the same time that our Dr. Roots passed away. And funny, I read some stories where Nancy also used Valerie a lot and was seen running around with this local root doctor in Savannah. I'm telling you, Savannah is the place to live. If you want an exciting life, you need to be living in Savannah, Georgia. Now, as you probably gathered from the beginning of this video, the Hamilton Turner house is now the Hamilton Turner Inn. It is like a bed and breakfast. It is, as I've said throughout the story, very haunted. We have, again, the ghost on the roof, and we have the little girl throwing the billiard ball, and potentially Joe Oden is still there throwing his lavish parties. Now, another ghost that seems to haunt this house is the ghost of somebody from the Civil War. You see, before the house was built, it is believed that perhaps one of the casualties of the Civil War was buried underneath the house. Many people claim to hear gunshots going off in the house when there's nobody there. And another common belief about this house is that the house was the inspiration for Walt Disney created his ride, the Haunted Mansion. They say that at some point when Walt Disney was developing his theme park, that a young Walt Disney was seen sitting outside of the house at Lafayette Square sketching the house. So if you're a fan of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil and you happen to be staying in Savannah, I would definitely suggest checking out the Hamilton Turner Inn. You'll be able to be in the exact location where Joe Oden, one of the characters in the book, as well as Nancy, aka Mandy, had a lot of their famous scandalous parties. If you just want to be in a haunted location, then it sounds like this is also the place to be. All right, thank you so much for sitting through another story, especially for going down this rabbit hole of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. As I said, it really started off as me wanting to do a story on Bonaventure Cemetery. However, this story of the Hamilton Turner Inn probably ended up being my favorite one to research. Just so much scandal, and the fact that the scandals were involved around seedy parties in this very wealthy, beautiful mansion just is very entertaining, and I do hope that you guys enjoyed it as well. Once again, thank you to Josh McKay for doing our music and to Todd Roderick for being our editor. You can follow us on Instagram at esotericatlanta, as well as Twitter. Again, we're new to Twitter, so be patient with us, and please, please, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys soon. Bye.